The air itself was a weapon, thin and sharp, slicing into the skin of the sacred mountains. Up here, where the world touches the sky, the stones are dyed red not just by the setting sun, but by the memory of silence. They called it a blessing, a divine honor, when they took a girl from her family. They said the gods had chosen her heart to be the bridge between earth and sky. But to a child barely old enough to understand fear, it was only a journey to a gilded cage. Killa was 12 years old, and the icy wind was already stealing the warmth from her cheeks. She was wrapped in the finest wool, yet she felt naked under the heavy, silent gaze of the men in their cloaks. These men were the Empire's shadow, leading her away from her life, leading her toward a destiny she did not choose, a purpose she did not understand, and a mountain that only knew how to take. This is the truth of the chosen women, the Akalawasi, the innocent children used as currency for the gods' favor. It is the story of Killa, whose sunshine and moonlight were traded for the cruel, beautiful promise of the Inca Empire. What happens when the greatest act of devotion is the utter destruction of a young, beating heart? The journey ended, not with a comforting hug or a warm fire, but with a wall of silent, heavy stone. This was the Akalawasi, the house of the chosen women. It looked like a prison built for the gods, perfectly cut stones, smooth and unforgiving, rising high against the thin blue sky. The men in the cloaks simply pushed Killa and the other terrified girls through a thick, wooden door. The sudden change was dizzying. Outside, the world was vast, cold, and loud with the wind's howl. Inside, it was small, warm, and terrifyingly silent. The only sound was the scraping of their sandals on the stone floors. The air was thick with the scent of old smoke and expensive incense, trying to cover up the smell of fear. Killa looked around. The courtyard was surrounded by tall walls that seemed to touch the sky. There were no windows facing outward, only inward. It was a palace, yes, but a prison first. A gilded cage, where the gold was in the fine fabrics they would weave, but the bars were the rules and the silence. Suddenly, a new group of people appeared. These were the mamaconers, the mother teachers. They were older women, their faces unsmiling and carved with years of absolute duty. They wore dark, heavy robes, and their eyes were flat and cold, like polished obsidian stone. Killa realized with a terrifying jolt that these women had once been like her. They were the girls who had not been sacrificed, the ones who had been chosen to stay and teach the new generation how to be perfect offerings. A mamaconer, the head of the house, whose name Killa didn't know and would never dare to ask, spoke. Her voice was low and smooth, but it cut through the silence like a knife. You are no longer girls from a village. Your family is gone. Your names are gone. The life you lived is gone. You are now the Aklakuna, the pure daughters of the sun. Your body belongs to the Sapa Inca. Your soul belongs to Inti. Killa felt the blood drain from her face. She remembered her mother's hands, warm and rough from the loom. Now, she was told she had no mother, only the cold stone walls. The first act of purification was stripping them bare. They took Killa's rough, familiar clothes and threw them into a fire outside. They washed her in cold, herbal water that stung her skin. Then they dressed her in the uniform of the Aklakuna, a fine, new tunic of soft llama wool. It was beautiful, dyed a deep imperial red, but it felt like a heavy chain. Every thread was a reminder that she was no longer Killa. She was an asset, a perfect thing being prepared for a purpose. The rules were simple and brutal. They were not allowed to speak unless they were spoken to. They could not look out of the walls. They could not cry. Crying showed weakness, and weakness was an offense to the sun god. They ate simple food in absolute silence, prayed for hours until their knees were raw, and learned that perfection was the only path to survival. One young girl next to Killa, barely 10 years old, let out a small, quiet sob. Before Killa could even turn her head, the head Mamakoner was there. No harsh words were spoken, only a long, silent stare of crushing disappointment. The girl instantly choked back the tears, her body shaking silently. That moment taught Killa more than any spoken threat could. In the Akalawasi, fear was the air they breathed, and silence was the highest form of duty. Killa knew then that the only way to endure was to become as cold and hard as the stones of the palace itself. This was the start of the rigorous training, a path that would lead some to high honor and others to the very high mountains. The second chapter of Killa's life in the Akalawasi began before the sun even dared to touch the high mountain peaks. They woke to the chilling sound of a wooden rattle, a noise that promised pain, not sleep. Every hour was accounted for, measured by the long shadows on the stone courtyard. The main work was split into two parts, weaving and brewing. First came the weaving. Killa was placed in a long, silent room where hundreds of looms stood like wooden skeletons. The air was filled with the soft fluff of llama wool and the much finer, softer threads of vicuña, a precious fiber reserved only for the Inca nobility and the gods. The Mamakoners taught them to spin the threads so thin they were almost invisible. They taught them to use bright, heavy dyes, imperial red, sun yellow, and deep ceremonial black. The demand was not for good work, but for perfection. A single loose thread, a slight unevenness in the pattern, or a knot that was too big was a disaster. These cloths were meant for the Sapa Inca, the living god on earth, or to wrap the holy objects in the temples. A flaw was not just a mistake. It was an insult to the sun god, Inti. Killa's fingers were too clumsy at first. She was used to rough, fast work in her village. Here, every movement had to be slow, precise, and perfect. One day, Killa messed up a complex diamond pattern. The Mamakoner named Mama Kori stood over her. She didn't shout or hit. She simply took a small obsidian knife and cut the entire section out. "You waste the gift of the gods," Mama Kori whispered, her voice like ice. "Start again. Your failure could bring drought to the fields." Killa worked through the night, her eyes burning and her fingers raw, haunted by the idea that thousands of people might starve because of her broken thread. The second, equally important task was the preparation of chicha. This was a sacred corn beer used in all major religious festivals and sacrifices. It was not just a drink. It was a way to communicate with the spirits and gods. The process was strange and intimate. Killa and the other girls had to chew the kernels of dried corn until they were a wet, mashed pulp. The saliva was necessary to start the fermentation process that turned the corn mash into the ceremonial beer. It was disgusting, tiring work, and Killa often felt sick. But the Mamakoners watched them with hawk-like attention. The chicha had to be sweet, strong, and pure. A single sign of sickness from a girl or a bad taste in the brew was seen as a terrible sign. It meant the girl was unclean or that the gods were displeased with the Akalawasi. The pressure was immense. They were literally holding the favor of the gods in their mouths. In the dead center of the chewing room, Killa saw a small chance to be human again. Next to her was Suma, a girl whose hands were as quick and clever as Killa's were clumsy. Suma's family had been highly respected weavers. As they silently mashed the corn, their eyes met across the piles of wet kernels. Suma's eyes were wide and terrified. Killa gave the tiniest, almost invisible shake of her head, a shared moment of terror. It was a risk, a silent communication that could have earned them both terrible punishment. But it was a link, a tiny thread of warmth in the cold, unforgiving stone house. They were being trained to be flawless, to be perfect tools. The Inca Empire did not see them as girls. It saw them as offerings. Whether they would be a bride for the Inca, a priestess for a temple, or a sacrifice to the mountain, the only path to safety, and sometimes even to death, was through absolute terrible perfection. Life in the Akalawasi was a constant lesson in silence, but Killa found that the house was full of things that screamed without sound. The loudest screams came from the mamaconers. These women, the mother teachers, were supposed to be the model of perfect devotion. They moved like ghosts through the stone halls, their faces empty of feeling. But sometimes, when Mama Cory thought no one was watching, Killa saw a flicker in her eyes. A deep, sad tiredness. A flash of something that looked like memory. Killa realized that the mamaconers were not just guards. They were prisoners too, trapped by their own perfect pasts. They had been chosen, they had excelled, and they had been rewarded with a life of endless duty, teaching the next generation to walk the same narrow, terrible path. They were living proof that surviving the Akalawasi meant losing the most important part of yourself. Their hearts were not broken. They were simply frozen stiff, like the high mountain lakes. The shared silence became the girls' new language. Killa and Suma, the girl who was good at weaving, found small, secret ways to communicate. When they were chewing corn for the chicha, hidden behind a large clay pot, Suma once tapped her fingers quickly. 3 taps, a pause, then 1 tap. Killa understood. Mother? Killa shook her head slightly, letting a single tear fall into the corn mash before quickly wiping it away. It was a language of pain, a reminder of the homes and families they had been forced to forget. Suma's small action made Killa remember her village and the games she used to play, chasing small, fast rodents in the fields. Now she was chasing a perfection that felt like death. These tiny moments of connection, a sympathetic glance, a shared shudder during the cold morning bath, were the broken bonds that kept a small piece of their humanity alive, even as the Empire tried to crush it. One evening, after the long, grueling prayers to Inti, the head mamaconer gathered the girls in the main chamber. She finally spoke about the future, the reason for their endless, perfect labor. "You are pure," the mamaconer announced, her voice echoing off the high stone ceiling. "The Empire has invested its greatest gifts in you. For the most perfect among you, there are 3 great honors." She held up 3 fingers, cold and long. "The first path," she said, lowering 1 finger, "is to become a high priestess. You will serve the sun temples, handling the sacred objects and advising the holy men. You will live a life of comfort, but your duty is to the gods alone. The second path," she continued, lowering the 2nd finger, "is to serve the Sapa Inca and his nobles. You will be given as wives or concubines to the highest men in the land. You will bring honor and powerful children to the Inca elite." These 2 paths were still chains, Killa thought, but they were chains of gold. Then the mamaconer held up the last finger, and the air in the room grew instantly colder, heavier. This was the path that all the girls knew, the one that haunted their sleep. "The third path," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "is the capicocha. This is the greatest honor. You will be chosen to join the sun god himself by being delivered to the sacred mountains. You will become a pure messenger, paying the ultimate price for the welfare of the Empire." The girls sat frozen. Killa realized with a horrible clarity. The better they were, the cleaner their weaving, the purer their chicha, the closer they came to that third, icy path. Their perfection was not a guarantee of life, but a qualification for the most horrific form of ritualized death. The mamaconers saw this as the highest mercy, to be chosen by the gods. Killa saw it as a sentence, a payment demanded by a cruel and hungry empire. The broken bonds of their past were now replaced by the terrible, shared knowledge of their uncertain, devastating future. The air in the Akalawasi changed instantly. One morning, the great iron bell in the city rang out, not with the rhythm of prayer, but with the sharp sound of fear. News arrived. A terrible drought had scorched the fields far to the south. The gods were angry. A great gift was demanded to save the people. The time for selection had come. For 3 days, the priests and the Sapa Inca's most powerful officials visited the house. They did not look at the girls' faces. They looked at the quality of their work. They felt the soft perfection of the textiles Suma had woven. They smelled the deep, pure sweetness of the chicha that Killa had helped prepare. The girls were lined up like statues, their hearts pounding a loud rhythm that only they could hear. Then the head priest raised a hand wrapped in gold thread. He spoke only one name, a name that echoed with terrible finality. Suma, daughter of the highlands, you have been chosen for the Capicocha. Killa watched as her friend, Suma, swayed slightly, but did not fall. Suma, the quick, clever weaver, had achieved the highest honor, the most total form of perfection. Her reward was death. Killa, clumsy and slow, was spared the mountain, but she was sentenced to watch the beginning of the end. The shadow of the mountain fell over Suma immediately. The moment her name was spoken, she stopped being a girl and became a sacred object. She was taken away from the others. The next days were spent on preparations that were both beautiful and cruel. Suma was dressed in layer upon layer of the most luxurious clothing. She wore the silks that had been woven by her own perfect hands. Priests rubbed her skin with oils and dusted her hair with the finest ground shell. Her ears were fitted with huge, heavy gold earrings that stretched the skin. Her neck and arms were covered in beautiful, intricate necklaces and bracelets of silver and gold. She looked like a goddess, too heavy with wealth and holiness to walk on the ground. Every detail was meant to erase the fear and create a sense of divine peace. She was fed the best foods, rich maize bread, meat, and delicacies she had never dreamed of eating. They told her she was going to sleep near the stars and wake up forever in the perfect house of Inti. But the most terrifying preparation involved the chicha. In the final ceremony, before the journey began, Suma was brought a bowl of the sacred corn beer, much stronger than the kind they brewed for festivals. This was the drink of forgetfulness. It was full of herbs that would dull her fear, slow her breath, and make her mind fuzzy and sleepy. The Aklakuna had spent months chewing corn to create this perfect brew, and now it was being used to prepare one of their own for a silent end. Killa watched from the shadows as Suma drank. Suma's eyes, which had always held a flash of life and fear, started to become distant and glazed. She was already leaving the world. Just before the priests cloaked her completely, Suma's eyes found Killis across the wide courtyard. Suma did not speak. She could not, but she lifted one hand, slightly, and very gently closed it. A silent message. Hold on to your life. Then the heavy, dark cloaks were placed over Suma, covering the gold, the fine weaving, and the last flicker of life in her eyes. The shadow of the mountain had swallowed her whole, and the men in their heavy travel robes were preparing to take their precious, drugged cargo up into the cold, thin air. Killa was left behind, a witness in the gilded cage, her life spared, but her heart broken by the sight of her friend's terrible, beautiful sacrifice. The morning of the departure was marked by a silence even heavier than the usual Akalawasi quiet. Killa stood in the courtyard, hidden behind a pillar, watching the priests and porters prepare for the climb. The men wore thick, rough wool, but Killa shivered just looking at the snow-capped peak that towered miles above the city, the mountain of sacrifice. Suma was brought out, completely covered by a great, dark blue cloak. her expensive gold jewelry rattling softly beneath the thick fabric. She moved slowly, like a doll being pulled by strings. The chicha had done its work. She was awake, but far away. The priests placed her on a wooden litter, a small, decorated platform meant for carrying precious cargo. Then, the procession began its terrifying journey. The ascent was not just a walk. It was a battle against the earth itself. The path went straight up, steeper and rockier with every step. The men carrying Suma were strong, but the mountain did not care about strength. The higher they climbed, the worse the air became. The air was thin and sharp, holding hardly any of the breath they needed to live. This was the Puna, the cruel, high land where only stones and ice truly thrived. Killa could not see them for long, but she knew the journey's pain. She had felt the thin air on the lower slopes near her village. She knew the way the altitude sickness could hit. The burning headache, the dizzy spells, the way your lungs begged for air that wasn't there. Suma, in her dazed state, was suffering it all, unable to even cry out or complain. The chicha that was supposed to bring peace was only silencing her pain, not stopping it. As the sun rose higher, the mountains seemed to absorb all the heat. The cold was absolute. It was the kind of cold that slipped through the wool and settled directly into the bones. The priests who walked beside the litter chanted prayers to Inti, the sun god, asking for strength, but the sun seemed far away and uncaring. Every few hours, the procession had to stop. The porters would gasp for breath, spitting up thin phlegm, and the priests would check on their living sacrifice. Suma was not allowed to look at the ground. She was taught that she was flying already halfway to the stars. But every movement of the litter, every painful, jarring step of the men beneath her, was a reminder of the rough reality. Though she was dressed in gold, she was just a small girl being carried up to her doom. Back in the Akalawasi, Killa could not sleep that night. She imagined the biting wind that was stripping the warmth from Suma's body thousands of feet above her. She imagined the final, sacred resting place, a small, rock-lined pit near the very peak, where the mountain itself would swallow its gift. The cruel irony of the Inca Empire's gift became clear. They treated her like a goddess for days, only to subject her to a journey so brutal, so physically demanding, that even the fittest men struggled. They were delivering their most precious possession to the highest possible point, showing the gods their utter devotion. But to Killa, watching the silent process in her mind, it was the purest, most horrifying act of cold-blooded destruction. The ascent was not a path to honor. It was the final, terrible act of suffering before the ultimate silence. After days of brutal climbing, the procession reached the very top, the sacred meeting point between the sky and the earth. This was the summit, a place of bare rock, eternal snow, and air so thin it felt like water running out of your hands. The wind screamed here, an endless, cruel sound that covered all others. The priests and porters were exhausted, their faces dark with cold. But their duty was not over. They had arrived at the Waka, the holy place where the offering would be made. It was a small, flat area of rock, cleared of snow, with a carefully built, stone-lined pit, the final resting place. Suma was taken from the litter. She was barely conscious now. The strong chicha and the terrible cold had done their work. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and slow. She was no longer fighting the cold or the fear. She was in a deep, dark, sleepy daze. This, the priests believed, was the greatest mercy. The gods wanted a perfect, peaceful gift, not a frightened, struggling child. The final ritual began in the deafening silence of the high altitude. They did not hurt her. They did not raise a weapon. Instead, they tended to her with care, as if putting a tired child to bed. They checked the layers of her fine wool clothing, making sure she was fully wrapped. They placed all the beautiful, heavy golden gifts around her in the pit. The tiny statues, the colorful feathers, the expensive pottery. She was a queen ready for her eternal rest. The head priest knelt and lifted Suma's head gently. He poured the last of the chicha down her throat. This was the final sleep aid, the last drink before the journey ended. Then, they laid her carefully down inside the cold stone pit, tucking her body into a fetal position. The way a baby sleeps, the way the ancient dead are sometimes found. The Inca Empire's horrific act was completed with a chilling, formal coldness. They did not need to use violence. They just needed the mountain. The extreme cold, combined with the powerful drugs, would cause her life to slow, then stop completely and silently within hours. She would simply slip away, freezing to death in a perfect, preserved, uncomplaining sleep. The priests performed their final prayers to the mountain gods, asking them to accept the gift of the pure young woman. Then, they covered the pit, not with heavy dirt, but with a layer of fine sand and stones, sealing the icy silence of the summit. They left her there, a perfect, frozen messenger between the empire and the gods, wrapped in the finest textiles the Akalawasi had ever produced. Miles below, in the stone silence of the Akalawasi, Killa heard the wind howl that night. She knew what it meant. Suma was gone. Killa had been spared the mountain, but she was not free. She would continue to weave, to chew corn, and to live in the gilded cage. But now, her perfection was tempered by a deep, cold understanding. The empire required not just duty, but the absolute destruction of innocence. The life of a chosen woman was not a path to honor, but a transaction where the currency was a girl's heartbeat. Killa lived on, a silent witness to a system that called brutal, slow death mercy. She carried the weight of Suma's frozen silence in her heart, a constant reminder of the horrific cost of peace and the monstrous hunger of the gods.